She came to save lives, but ended up exposing a truth that could change healthcare forever. St. Vincent Medical Center was a respected pillar of healthcare in an affluent suburb, known for its spotless corridors and esteemed reputation. But beneath the polished surface, something darker lingered. When Melody Carter, a skilled African-American nurse, arrived for her first day, she had no idea her dream job would quickly become a test of character, resilience, and dignity. The early morning sun glinted off the hospital windows as Melody stepped inside, her heart fluttering with a mix of hope and nerves. The scent of antiseptic filled the air, but there was another feeling too, an invisible tension she couldn't quite name. As she walked toward the nurses' station, conversations halted, glances were exchanged, and then quickly avoided. Her polite greeting met silence. This wasn't the welcome she had expected. "Excuse me," Melody said gently. "I'm Melody Carter, the new nurse. Could you point me to the head nurse's office?" A tall, blonde nurse glanced up, her smile too tight to be genuine. "Down the hall, third door on the right," she replied coolly. Melody thanked her and walked the hallway, her professional shoes clicking in the silence. Just as she approached the door, a tall man in a white coat appeared from an exam room. He looked like the kind of doctor who had been there for decades, distinguished, with salt and pepper hair and a presence that commanded attention. "Good morning, Doctor," Melody said warmly, extending her hand. "I'm Melody Carter, the new nurse on staff." His cold grey eyes met hers for a second. "Dr. Richard Langston," he replied tersely. "Let's hope you're familiar with our standards. We don't tolerate mistakes at St. Vincent." Before she could respond, he brushed past her. That encounter stung. But Melody remembered her mother's voice in her head, the way she always encouraged her to rise above. "Baby girl," she had said, "you're going to have to work twice as hard to get half the credit. But don't ever let them see you sweat." Melody carried that strength with her. She had studied harder, worked longer hours, and earned top marks in her nursing program. Her passion for helping people had never wavered. And now, standing inside one of the best hospitals in the state, she resolved to let her actions speak louder than anyone's doubts. The head nurse, Ms. Ferguson, greeted her with the kind of formality reserved for a meeting, not a welcome. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice clipped. "We run a tight ship here. Let's hope you're up to it." The day was a blur of orientations and new faces, most of whom offered polite but distant interactions. When Melody entered a room, conversations would stop. When she tried to make small talk, she was met with tight smiles or sudden excuses to leave. She wasn't naive. She had felt this before. But it still hurt. Later that evening, as she changed back into her street clothes, she overheard two nurses whispering nearby. "Did you see the new hire?" one said. "Yeah," the other replied. "I don't know what they were thinking. This isn't exactly the neighborhood for someone like that." Melody stood frozen, her hand gripping her locker door. She had hoped the cold reception was just first-day awkwardness, but now the truth lay bare. This would be an uphill battle. She walked to the bus stop under the dimming sky, her steps heavy, her spirit worn. Sitting on the bench, she dialed her mother. "Hey, Mama," she said softly, trying to sound strong. "Hey, baby girl, how was your first day?" Melody hesitated, then admitted, "It was rough, Mama. Really rough." "Melody Joy Carter," her mother said gently but firmly. "You didn't come this far to quit now. You hold your head high. You're not just doing this for you. You're doing this for every little black girl who dreams of wearing that uniform. Tears welled in Melody's eyes. "Yes, ma'am. I hear you." Just then, a sleek, black car pulled up. Melody recognized the driver, Dr. Langston. He rolled down the window, his voice dripping with insincerity. "Waiting for the bus? Guess that's what a nurse's salary gets you," he sneered before speeding away. Melody sat still, humiliated, but not broken. She closed her eyes and breathed in deep. Her mother's voice echoed again. "Don't let them see you falter." She wouldn't. She couldn't. Tomorrow would be another test. But she was ready, because while the walls of St. Vincent was spotless, it was clear that something ugly had taken root beneath the surface, and Melody Carter was not the kind of woman to look away from what needed to be faced, what no one at St. Vincent knew, yet was that this new nurse, with her calm voice and steady hands, would become the spark that ignited a reckoning. And nothing, not even the old guard's deepest prejudices, could stop it from coming. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn Carter's quiet arrival at St. Mary's General Hospital, her once promising optimism began to erode beneath the weight of persistent exclusion. While she had braced herself for challenges, she hadn't anticipated the depth of resistance she would face, not just in isolated incidents, but embedded within the very fabric of the hospital's culture. What had initially felt like distant politeness now revealed itself as a more insidious form of dismissal. Evelyn, a poised and capable black nurse in her 30s, worked diligently on her morning rounds, taking care to ensure each patient received attentive care. Yet time and time again, she noticed the pattern. White colleagues were greeted with casual warmth, while her presence seemed to put others on edge. Conversations would fall silent as she approached, and the occasional smiles she received never quite reached the eyes of the ones offering them. The worst, however, was Dr. Richard Gaines. Dr. Gaines, a senior physician with decades of tenure and a reputation for excellence, had made it his mission, whether consciously or not, to undermine Evelyn's confidence at every turn. He never raised his voice, never explicitly crossed professional lines, but his tone was always cold, his feedback cutting, and his instructions dripping with condescension. "Nurse Carter," he said one morning, across the bustling nurses' station, his voice loud enough to turn heads, "I do hope by now you've familiarized yourself with our protocols. We can't afford any mistakes." The emphasis on mistakes hung in the air like a threat. "Yes, Doctor." "Gaines," Evelyn replied evenly, meeting his gaze. "I am fully versed in all hospital procedures." A small smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "We'll see about that, won't we?" Throughout the day, Evelyn found herself continuously assigned the most difficult patients. Cases that required the most physical and emotional labor. Patients known for their temper or conditions that demanded constant attention seemed always to fall under her care. One such assignment came when a fellow nurse approached her with a syrupy smile. "Evelyn, would you mind checking in on Mr. Johnson in room 305? He's been a bit challenging today." That was an understatement. Mr. Johnson had driven 2 nurses to tears in the last week with his racist remarks and demanding demeanor. Evelyn, aware of what this entailed, simply nodded. "I'll take care of it." When she entered his room, Mr. Johnson's expression soured immediately. "What are you doing here?" he barked. "I told them I don't want no colored nurse touching me." Evelyn steadied her breath, suppressing the anger rising in her chest. "Mr. Johnson, I'm here to check your vitals and change your dressing. I assure you, I'm more than qualified to provide your care." He didn't stop. The insults came fast, vicious, and vile. Yet, Evelyn never once lost her composure. She performed her duties with calm professionalism, even as his words sought to reduce her worth. When she finally emerged, she was greeted by Dr. Gaines leaning against the wall. "Everything all right in there, Nurse Carter? We heard quite the commotion." She didn't flinch. "Mr. Johnson's vitals are stable, and his dressing has been changed. Is there anything else you need from me, Doctor?" For a moment, Dr. Gaines looked almost surprised, but the expression quickly shifted back to smug superiority. "Let's hope you can maintain that level of composure with all your patients." "We wouldn't want any complaints now, would we?" Evelyn said nothing. She knew she'd passed a test she never should have had to take, but the day wasn't over. She returned to her rounds, each task heavier than the last. Her white colleagues had time for casual conversation, laughter, even breathers. Evelyn, on the other hand, was running non-stop. She double-checked every chart, every medication dose, not out of doubt in her abilities, but because she knew the tiniest error would be weaponized against her. Later, at her locker, she overheard two nurses whispering, "Can you believe they're making such a big deal about diversity hires?" One sneered. "It's not like she can keep up with the rest of us anyway," the other responded. Evelyn's hand froze on her locker door. Her body was tired, but her spirit trembled more from the humiliation than the fatigue. As she waited at the bus stop that evening, a sleek black Mercedes slowed down in front of her. The window rolled down. Dr. Gaines was behind the wheel. "Nurse Carter," he said smoothly. "Waiting for the bus again? Such a shame. Looks like that's all a nurse's salary affords these days." He drove off before she could reply. Evelyn clenched her jaw. The cruelty in his voice was deliberate, the timing perfect to wound. But she remembered her mother's words, spoken to her countless times growing up. "Hold your head high, baby. You don't let them see you falter." As the bus rolled in, she stood tall. She had no idea that help was already on the way, and that soon her quiet strength would shake the very foundations of St. Mary's General Hospital. Despite the increasingly harsh environment at Ashgrove Medical Center, Evelyn Carter continued to show up every day with her head held high and her heart firmly set on giving her best. But it was becoming harder with each shift. The quiet stares had turned into whispered remarks, and those whispers carried a sting Evelyn knew all too well. Being one of the few black nurses in a prestigious, predominantly white suburban hospital, she was no stranger to being othered. But what had begun as cold shoulders and polite avoidance was now growing into open disdain. Assignments seemed to pile disproportionately onto her schedule, and while others handled routine checkups and easy recoveries, Evelyn was tasked with the most complex and emotionally taxing patients, many of whom seemed handpicked to test her limits. There was one patient in particular who made her heart sink every time she saw his name, Mr. Donald Walker, in room 305. Word around the nurses' station was that he had driven two nurses to tears in under a week, and for good reason. Donald, an older man in his 70s with a long history of bitterness and a mouthful of venom, had made it clear that he didn't want any nurse of color caring for him. "I told them," he snapped the moment Evelyn walked into his room, "I don't want no colored girl near me. Get out!" Evelyn didn't flinch. She stood still for a beat, her hand tightening on the chart she carried. "Mr. Walker," she said calmly, "I'm here to check your vitals and tend to your wounds. You'll be taken care of with the utmost professionalism." Her voice didn't tremble, Her hands, as always, were steady, and though his words hit like daggers, Evelyn moved through her duties with grace, skill, and a deep reservoir of restraint that had been honed through years of walking into rooms like this. Outside his room, Dr. Richard Gaines waited, arms crossed, watching like a hawk. "Everything all right in there, Nurse Carter?" he asked with that same condescending tone he always used, sweet on the surface, but dipped in poison underneath. "Mr. Walker's vitals are stable," Evelyn replied, keeping her tone respectful, "and his bandages have been changed." She didn't mention the string of racial slurs she had endured. She knew it wouldn't matter. "Well," Dr. Gaines said, adjusting his expensive tie, "let's hope you can keep that level of control with the rest of your patients. Wouldn't want anyone filing complaints, would we?" Evelyn returned to the nurses' station without a word. Around her, the other nurses continued their soft chatter, none offering her a glance, let alone support. If they felt anything about the unfairness she faced daily, they kept it to themselves, and that silence, that complicity, cut deeper than Mr. Walker's insults. Her shift continued with back-to-back assignments that left her no time to eat or even breathe. While her colleagues sat for coffee or chatted by the windows, Evelyn ran from one room to the next. She double-checked every note, triple-checked every dose. Not because she didn't trust herself, but because she knew others didn't. A single misstep could become a headline. Later, as she returned to the locker room, she heard two nurses talking just around the corner. "It's all this diversity nonsense," one of them muttered. "She's not even that good. She's just here to make the hospital look progressive." "She won't last," the other replied. "They never do." Evelyn's hand froze on her locker door. For a long moment, she stood there, breathing through the pain of those words. She wanted to turn that corner and look them in the eye, but instead, she exhaled, quietly gathered her things, and left the hospital without a word. Confrontation would only confirm their biases. Her mother's voice rang in her ears like it always did. "Baby girl, don't you dare let them see you falter." Outside, the sky was darkening, the parking lot cast in golds and purples. She walked to the bus stop in silence, her feet sore, her heart heavier than usual. Just as she sat on the cold plastic bench, a sleek black Mercedes slowed beside her. Through the tinted window, she saw Dr. Gaines again, his smug face behind the wheel. "Still riding the bus, Nurse Carter?" he called out mockingly. "What a shame. Guess that's all you can afford on a nurse's salary, huh?" And with a cruel chuckle, he drove off. Evelyn didn't cry. She didn't react. She just looked forward, her jaw tight, her eyes burning but dry. His words weren't just about money. They were meant to diminish her, to remind her that no matter how competent she was, she'd never be seen as equal here. But she was not just working for a paycheck. She was working for every patient who needed her, for every black student who dreamed of becoming a nurse. For the legacy of her grandmother, who had been a nurse's aide in the segregated South and taught her that quiet dignity was its own kind of strength. When she got home, she sat at her small kitchen table and pulled out an old photo album. In it were pictures of her mother in her own nurse's uniform, proud and tired, standing in front of the first hospital she'd ever worked at. Underneath was a note written in her mother's hand. "They can't take your purpose from you. Only you can do that." That night, Evelyn lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the words from her mother echoing in her chest. She knew tomorrow would be no different. The insults might still come, the assignments might still be skewed, the eyes would still watch, waiting for her to stumble. But she also knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would be back, because her presence in that hospital mattered, and because change didn't start with a system, it started with a person refusing to bow. As the days unfolded at St. Luke's Medical Center, Evelyn Carter felt the mounting pressure inch closer, like an encroaching tide. Though her posture remained upright and her steps steady, the emotional weight of her daily experience was beginning to tell. The initial polite indifference from her colleagues had curdled into something colder, harder, and far more isolating. Evelyn, despite her years of experience and quiet strength, now found herself at the center of a quiet storm, one she never asked to enter. Each morning began the same. She arrived early, greeted the receptionist with a warm nod, then headed to the nurses' station, where she would be met with either silence or tight smiles that never reached anyone's eyes. Her name was rarely spoken aloud. Instead, people said, "her," or "that nurse." It was as if uttering her name gave her presence a weight they didn't want to acknowledge. Evelyn could feel it in every interaction. The loaded glances, the way conversations would halt mid-sentence when she walked by, and then resume in hushed tones once she was out of earshot. Her assignments, once a varied mix of patient care, had become strangely predictable. She was consistently given the most demanding patients, often those who had reputations for being verbally abusive, medically complex, or both. It didn't escape her notice that her white colleagues were spared from these cases more often than not. But Evelyn never complained. She tackled each task with quiet resolve, not because she had to prove herself, but because her patients deserved dignity, no matter how difficult they might be. One patient in particular, Mr. Johnson in room 305, had already sent 2 nurses into tears with his relentless tirades. Rumor had it he was a retired military man, fiercely opinionated and bitter from years of unmanaged pain. When Evelyn entered his room, she did so with calm professionalism, knowing what she was about to face. "What are you doing here?" he spat the moment she appeared. "I said I don't want your kind touching me." She paused for a fraction of a second, just long enough to breathe in deeply through her nose and exhale through her mouth. "Mr. Johnson, I'm here to check your vitals and clean your dressing. I assure you, your care is my top priority." His face twisted into a scowl, and the insults began. But Evelyn continued her work with a calm so steady it could have been forged from stone. She finished her task quickly and efficiently, not giving his venom any more space than necessary. As she exited the room, she found Dr. Wallace waiting in the hallway, his face wearing a mask of mock concern. "Everything all right in there, Nurse Carter? We heard some colorful language." She met his gaze evenly. "Mr. Johnson is stable. His dressing is clean. There's nothing further to report." Dr. Wallace's eyebrows raised, surprised at her calm. "Let's hope you can keep that composure with all your patients," he said, with a slight smirk. "We wouldn't want any complaints." Evelyn knew what he meant. She wasn't just being watched, she was being tested, judged, and worst of all, set up to fail. The rest of the day passed in a blur of tasks that left her feet aching and her back sore. She double-checked every note, every chart, every dose she administered, knowing that the smallest slip-up would not be forgiven. Not for her. As she moved from one patient to the next, she couldn't help but notice the ease with which her colleagues moved through their own duties, smiling, chatting, moving leisurely through the hallways while she scrambled just to stay afloat. By late afternoon, she stopped by the nurses' lounge to grab a cup of water. Around the corner, she overheard two nurses whispering. "It's getting ridiculous," one said. "All this fuss over hiring someone for the sake of diversity." "She can't keep this pace forever," the other replied. "Eventually she'll trip up. They always do." Evelyn turned away, her heart heavy. The remarks were sharper than any needle, and no matter how thick her skin had become, they still hurt. Still, she refused to let it show. She carried her cup back to her station, head held high, her mind repeating the words her mother once said. "They can question your place, but they can't question your purpose." It was near the end of her shift when she made her final stop to room 412. Thomas Everett, the man everyone referred to as the VIP patient, had broken both arms in a skiing accident. Despite his condition, he always sat upright in bed with an air of quiet intelligence. His hair was neatly combed, and his eyes always sharp, as if he saw more than he let on. "Nurse Carter," he greeted, his voice carrying a comforting weight. "You look tired." She smiled politely, brushing it off. "Busy day, sir." He tilted his head, studying her. "Not just busy. Heavy. There's a difference." Evelyn blinked, taken aback by the accuracy of his words. "I suppose you're right. You handle yourself well. But I've seen it. How they treat you. It's not right." She froze in place. No one had acknowledged it. Not directly, and certainly not someone of his apparent status. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet. Mr. Everett nodded. "You have more strength than most people in this building. But let me ask you something. When is strength also the courage to say something?" Evelyn didn't have an answer. Not then. But his words lingered in her mind as she clocked out that evening. Outside, under the fading sun, Evelyn sat alone at the bus stop. Her shoulders slumped just slightly now that no one was watching. She pulled out her phone and called her mother. "Hey, Mama. How was your day, baby?" Evelyn paused, then whispered, "Hard." Her mother's voice was soft but sure. Hard doesn't mean impossible. You didn't get this far just to let them wear you down. And you're not alone. As the bus rumbled toward her, Evelyn stood up slowly, the memory of Mr. Everett's words mixing with her mother's. She still had questions, but one thing was clear. The story unfolding at St. Luke's was bigger than her, and whether she liked it or not, she had a part to play. Tomorrow would be another test, another burden to carry, but tonight she would rest. Because this fight wasn't over, and she wasn't done rising. As the sun rose over St. Mary's General Hospital, casting long golden rays through its glass-paneled entrance, there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. The halls buzzed with hushed excitement and wary whispers. Edward Langston, still recovering in room 412, had unknowingly set a domino effect in motion, one that would challenge the very foundations of a system long steeped in quiet prejudice. Angela Parker, now standing at the precipice of a personal and professional reckoning, woke that morning with a heavy heart and a heavier sense of responsibility. For weeks she had endured the subtle slights, the isolating glances, and the weight of being held to a different standard. But today, something was different. It wasn't just the day of a high-stakes operation, it was the day that would define her place in the story. Not as a victim, but as a voice that would no longer be silenced. When Angela arrived, the hospital was a hive of activity. Nurses moved briskly, carts clanged, and tension hung like humidity in July. Word had spread that a critical emergency operation would be observed by not just hospital leadership, but visiting board members and outside healthcare executives. There was an unmistakable undercurrent of anxiety, especially among the staff who had grown accustomed to working under the radar. As Angela approached the nurses' station, she was intercepted by Dr. William Greaves, the man who had, since her first day, made it his mission to undermine her. His voice, clipped and expressionless, delivered a directive that was anything but ordinary. "Nurse Parker," he said, handing her a crisp surgical file, "you'll be assisting in today's procedure. Make sure you're ready." There's no room for error. To an outsider, the assignment might have looked like a mark of respect, a vote of confidence, but Angela, after everything she'd experienced, knew better. This wasn't recognition. This was a setup. A public operation with powerful eyes watching meant stakes were higher, mistakes more visible, and consequences more severe. But Angela didn't flinch. She took the file, nodded respectfully, and turned to prep. "Yes, Dr. Greaves." "I'll be ready," she replied, her voice calm and deliberate. In the scrub room, as Angela washed her hands and secured her mask, she reflected on her journey so far. She had entered St. Mary's full of hope and professionalism, only to find herself drowning in a culture where competence alone wasn't enough to earn acceptance. Yet, through every sleepless night and every whispered insult, she had endured. Her mother's voice rang in her head like a hymn. "Hold your head high. Do your job better than anyone else. And don't you dare let them see you falter." Today, she would honor those words. Inside the OR, tension coiled tight. Angela took her place, sterile gloved hands ready. The patient, a middle-aged man suffering from internal trauma, was prepped on the table. The board members observed silently through the glass. Dr. Greaves stood at the head of the operation, flanked by senior surgeons. Everything about the moment felt heavy. Angela knew the slightest misstep could be used to justify everything they already believed about her. But then, something unexpected happened, as Dr. Greaves raised his scalpel to begin a delicate incision. His hand shook, barely, but noticeably. Angela's eyes caught it. His hesitation could be chalked up to pressure, nerves, or fatigue. But his next move was riskier, a cut too close to a major vessel. Years of training kicked in. Angela's voice, steady and assertive, pierced the silence. "Doctor, might I suggest we adjust our angle? The patient's anatomy suggests a safer route." The room froze. Eyes turned. For a few long seconds, no one breathed. Greaves stared at her. Disbelief, then fury flashed across his face. But somewhere beneath his ego, he knew she was right. With a begrudging grunt, he nodded and adjusted. The incision went clean. No complications. The operation proceeded without further issue. But Angela's intervention had not gone unnoticed. After the procedure, as instruments were cleared and team members dispersed, Dr. Greaves summoned Angela. "I need to speak with you. Now," he said, through gritted teeth. She followed him out of the OR, heart pounding, but posture strong. They walked to an empty room, except it wasn't empty. It was Edward Langston's. Angela barely had time to react before Greaves turned on her. His voice dropped, dripping venom. "How dare you undermine me in front of the board? You think because you read a textbook you know better than a surgeon with 30 years of experience?" He stepped closer. You were hired to tick a diversity box, nothing more. And today, you proved exactly why you don't belong here. Angela's mouth went dry. The bile of fury and shame rose in her throat. But before she could reply, a deeper voice rang out from the hospital bed behind her. "That's enough, Doctor." Greaves. It was Edward Langston, awake, listening, and clearly furious. Both turned to him, startled. The man who had spent the past few days as a quiet observer now radiated authority. His voice, low and commanding, carried the weight of someone used to making decisions that mattered. "I've heard enough," Edward continued, sitting upright. "What I witnessed today confirms everything I suspected about the culture here at St. Mary's, and about you." His gaze bore into Greaves, who had turned pale. "You nearly compromised a patient's safety because your pride couldn't handle being corrected by someone you deem beneath you. That ends today." Angela stood frozen, overwhelmed by the moment. For the first time, someone in power had not only heard her truth, but spoken it aloud. The weight she had carried, the invisibility, the gaslighting, the isolation, suddenly felt lighter. Edward turned to her, his voice softening. "Nurse Parker, you saved a life today, and you may have just saved this hospital." It was only the beginning. The next morning at St. Mary's General Hospital dawned with a kind of quiet suspense that older staff members hadn't felt in years. There was an undercurrent in the air, not fear exactly, but the undeniable sense that something significant had shifted. Angela Parker arrived early, as always, but this time there was a new presence surrounding her. Recognition. She walked past the reception desk and noticed more than a few colleagues offering nods, some with hesitant smiles. The previous day's events, her poised correction in the operating room, Dr. Greaves's outburst, and Edward Langston's startling intervention, had made their rounds like wildfire. Whispers had become conversations. Silence had cracked open, letting truth spill out into the bright, sterile hallways of a hospital long protected by status and reputation. Word had already spread about Mr. Langston's real identity. No longer seen as just another VIP patient, he was now known by his full title, CEO of Healthcare United, one of the most powerful figures in the American healthcare system. To the staff who had dismissed Angela as simply a diversity hire, this revelation hit like a thunderclap. And today, change was in motion. An announcement came over the hospital's public address system just after 8 a.m. sharp. "All staff, please report to the main auditorium for a mandatory meeting at 8:30. Attendance is required." The words echoed through the corridors like a call to reckoning. By 8:25, the auditorium was filled, shoulder to shoulder, with nurses in scrubs, doctors in white coats, administrative assistants, and even janitorial staff. Angela sat near the front, nerves bubbling under her composed exterior. As much as she had weathered the storm, she wasn't sure what the next chapter would bring. Then the doors opened, and in walked Edward Langston, not in a hospital gown this time, but in a sharp grey suit, his arm still in a sling. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced giants in boardrooms and won. At his side was the hospital administrator, looking uneasy, and several other senior leaders. The room hushed to stillness as Edward approached the podium. He didn't begin with platitudes or empty acknowledgements. His voice was calm, but resolute. "Good morning. Many of you now know who I am. My name is Edward Langston, CEO of Healthcare United. What you may not know is that I spent the past few weeks here as a patient, and during that time, I bore witness to something deeply troubling, not just as a man who depends on quality care, but as a leader responsible for ensuring healthcare reflects the values of dignity, fairness, and accountability. He paused and scanned the room. What I saw at St. Mary's was not simply the work of a few bad actors. I saw a pattern, a culture that quietly allows discrimination to thrive. I witnessed a nurse, Ms. Angela Parker, subjected to daily indignities and professional sabotage simply because of who she is. Let me be very clear. This is not just morally wrong, it's dangerous. It compromises patient care, it weakens teams, and it damages the soul of this institution. The weight of his words pressed heavy on the room. Some staff members shifted uncomfortably. Others looked down. A few nodded, visibly moved. Edward continued, his tone firm. Change starts today. Effective immediately, Dr. William Greaves has been placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation. Furthermore, St. Mary's will undergo a comprehensive audit of its hiring, promotion, and workplace behavior practices. All staff will participate in mandatory diversity and inclusion training, not as a box to check, but as a commitment to excellence and respect. Then came the moment that took Angela's breath away. I'm also pleased to announce that Nurse Angela Parker has agreed to serve as the new Chief Diversity Officer here at St. Mary's. Her insight, resilience, and integrity will be instrumental in leading us toward a culture that values every member of its team. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then steady. Angela stood, not expecting the attention, but accepting the responsibility with quiet grace. In the back rows, even a few of the nurses who had once whispered behind her back now clapped, some sheepishly, others sincerely. Edward closed the meeting with a powerful reminder. You don't build better hospitals with bricks and beams. You build them with people, valued, respected, and heard. As the room emptied and the staff filtered back to their departments, something unspoken lingered in the air. Hope. For the first time in years, St. Mary's General Hospital wasn't just known for its state-of-the-art equipment or its prestigious name. It was becoming something more meaningful, a place where change was possible, where truth could be spoken aloud, and where dignity finally had a seat at the table. A few days after the sweeping changes were announced at St. Mary's General Hospital, a subtle but undeniable transformation began to take root. For long-time employees who had grown used to the unspoken hierarchies and daily silences, it felt like the air itself had shifted, cleaner somehow, as though the truth had finally cracked open the windows that had remained shut for too long. At the heart of this change was Angela Parker, now formally appointed as the Chief Diversity Officer. Just weeks before, she had walked through those same halls unseen, unheard, and unfairly judged. Now, she moved through them with the quiet confidence of someone who had not only survived adversity, but turned it into purpose. Angela didn't come to this role with fanfare or lofty speeches. She came with a notepad, an open door, and a listening ear. She knew that real change, especially in an institution as deeply rooted as St. Mary's, wouldn't happen overnight. It would be slow, sometimes uncomfortable, and often resisted. But she also knew something else. Change that lasts is change built on truth. Her first few days in the new position were spent meeting with staff at every level. Nurses, janitors, doctors, technicians, even cafeteria workers. She asked questions no one had ever bothered to ask. What makes your job harder than it needs to be? Do you feel respected here? Do you feel heard? And when they answered, she listened, not with the distant nod of someone fulfilling a quota, but with the genuine attention of a person who had lived through what they were describing. For many older staff members, especially those who had worked at St. Mary's for decades, the shift was bittersweet. Some confessed that they had always sensed something broken in the culture, but never felt they had the power or the permission to speak up. Others were hesitant, unsure of what change would mean for the traditions and systems they had grown used to. Angela didn't dismiss those concerns. She welcomed them. "I'm not here to erase your history," she told a group of senior nurses during one roundtable. "I'm here to help us build a future where no one has to endure what I did just to be seen as equal." Meanwhile, Edward Langston, still recovering from his skiing injury but back in his corporate role, remained closely involved. Though he had returned to the offices of Healthcare United, his influence continued to ripple through St. Mary's. He personally funded training programs, set up regular progress reviews, and even sat in on Zoom meetings with department heads. To him, this wasn't just about fixing one hospital. It was about setting a national example. One quiet afternoon, Angela found herself walking through the hospital's atrium, where a new mural had just been completed. Commissioned by Edward and created by a local artist, it depicted a circle of healthcare workers of all backgrounds, Black, white, Latino, Asian, standing together, not in uniforms, but in casual clothes, laughing and supporting one another. Below it, in large bronze lettering, were the words, "Diversity is our strength. Inclusion is our commitment. Compassion is our calling." Angela stood in front of the mural for several minutes, her thoughts drifting. She thought of her first day, how the halls felt cold and distant, how her colleagues avoided eye contact, how even the sound of her footsteps felt too loud, and she thought of her mother's voice, still clear in her mind. "Don't let them see you sweat, baby girl." She hadn't just held back the sweat, she'd held up the mirror. Later that evening, as she was locking her new office, a modest space tucked behind the administrative wing, an older janitor named Carl stopped her in the hallway. He had been working at St. Mary's since the early 80s, and Angela had passed him in the halls dozens of times without ever really exchanging more than a polite nod. "You're doing good work, Miss Parker," he said, his voice low and sincere. "Never thought I'd see the day someone finally stood up and stayed standing." Angela smiled, deeply moved. "Thank you, Carl. That means more than you know." As she stepped out into the early evening light, Angela knew the work was far from done. There would still be resistance, there would still be setbacks. But now, for the first time, the change was visible. The conversations were happening, and the walls of silence that had once seemed immovable were beginning to crumble. And to the older men and women who'd spent a lifetime believing things would never change, Angela Parker had become a living reminder. Sometimes it takes just one voice to break through, and one heart strong enough to keep speaking. The tension in the hospital corridors had been growing for weeks, but everything changed the moment Sam Brennan stepped forward to speak. Helen Whitaker, the once overlooked nurse now standing in the center of institutional upheaval, barely had time to process what had just occurred. In front of Dr. Richard Langston, the hospital staff, and several administrative leaders, Sam Brennan revealed his true identity: CEO of Healthcare United, the most powerful healthcare conglomerate in the country. Sam, still recovering in his hospital bed, looked at Helen with deep admiration. He had seen enough: the veiled contempt, the exclusionary culture, and most of all, the way Helen handled every obstacle with quiet strength and unwavering professionalism. His voice, calm but resolute, cut through the silence of the packed administrative meeting room. "The behavior I have witnessed here isn't just unprofessional," he said. "It's a systemic failure, and it ends today." Helen stood nearby, her hands gently folded in front of her. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, many of them the same ones that had once looked past her, through her. Now, they saw her clearly, and some, perhaps for the first time, were beginning to understand. Sam Brennan went on to demand an immediate investigation into the hospital's hiring and promotion practices. He called for the suspension of Dr. Langston pending a thorough review, and perhaps most notably, he recommended the formation of a diversity and inclusion committee to reshape the institution from within. And at the center of that vision, he named Helen Whitaker. "Nurse Whitaker will serve on this committee," Sam announced. "Her experience, her insight, and her integrity are precisely what this hospital needs." The room was silent for a beat. Then murmurs began, some surprised, some in agreement, others skeptical, but Helen remained composed. She didn't need their approval. Not anymore. After the meeting, as she walked down the hall, people she had worked alongside for weeks now looked at her differently. One or two nodded politely. A few offered timid smiles. Even those who had once whispered behind her back now stood silently, unsure of how to approach her. Later that afternoon, Helen visited Sam in his room. He was sitting up, dressed in a blazer over his hospital gown, reading reports with the seriousness of a man already back to work. "You didn't have to do that," Helen said quietly. "Yes, I did," Sam replied. "I couldn't stay silent, not after everything I saw." Helen looked at him, her voice steady. "But it changes everything." Sam gave a gentle smile. "That's the point." In the days that followed, St. Mary's became a different place. Not all at once. There were still whispers, still resistance. Change never comes easy, especially in institutions that have long prided themselves on appearances rather than realities. But the presence of someone with real power backing reform made all the difference. Helen's role on the Diversity and Inclusion Committee gave her a voice in rooms she had once been excluded from. Her proposals were thoughtful, evidence-based, and compassionate. She focused not on punishment, but on rebuilding trust and re-educating those who had been blind to their own biases. Dr. Langston was placed on leave. An investigation began. And Helen, once dismissed and marginalized, now had a seat at the table where real decisions were made. One evening, Helen called her mother, Margaret, as she left the hospital. "Mama, I don't know if I'm ready for all this," she confessed. Her mother's voice was calm and strong on the other end. "Baby, you've been ready your whole life. This world doesn't always change because it wants to. Sometimes it changes because someone brave enough makes it." Helen looked up at the darkening sky, her breath catching slightly. For the first time since she arrived at St. Mary's, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before: hope. The road ahead would still be long. There would be pushback, failures, frustrations. But now, she wasn't walking it alone. And more importantly, she was walking it with purpose. The announcement that Helen Whitaker would become the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at St. Mary's General Hospital sent ripples through the building, like a sudden gust of wind in a still room. For months, the hospital's halls had been thick with silent tension, the kind that couldn't be measured on charts or remedied with prescriptions. And now, for the first time, That silence was breaking. Helen, once isolated, now found herself in the spotlight, but not in the way she had ever imagined. It wasn't just the weight of a new title that settled on her shoulders. It was the weight of expectation, of change, of responsibility, of history. Older staff members, many of whom had worked at St. Mary's for decades, seemed unsure of how to approach Helen now. Some kept their distance, watching her from behind clipboards and whispered conversations. Others, like Julia Harmon, who once couldn't hide her discomfort in Helen's presence, were slowly beginning to thaw. Julia had been one of the first to approach her after the hospital-wide meeting. Her words had been simple. "I didn't see it before, but I do now. I'm sorry." It wasn't an apology that could erase months of slights, but it was a beginning. Helen had nodded with quiet grace, aware that real change never came overnight. Each morning, Helen arrived early, walking the same corridors where she had once felt invisible. Now every step carried a different kind of energy. People noticed, they listened, they even asked questions. In meetings, Helen's voice was no longer the one politely ignored or strategically overlooked. It was the voice leading discussions, setting policies, and guiding a new cultural direction. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her quiet strength commanded the room. Sam Brennan, the CEO of Healthcare United and the former mysterious patient, continued to be a powerful presence in the background. He checked in with Helen weekly, sometimes by phone, sometimes in person. Though his schedule was packed, he made it a point to prioritize this transformation. "This is more than an initiative," he told her one afternoon in her small corner office. "It's a responsibility. And you're the right person to lead it." His belief in her hadn't wavered since the day he spoke up in her defense. That trust gave Helen a kind of grounding that went beyond confidence. It gave her purpose. But not everyone embraced the change. Some staff members viewed the new diversity measures as unnecessary or performative. "We're here to treat patients, not push politics," one doctor grumbled in a staff meeting. Helen didn't flinch. Instead, she calmly reminded him, and the rest of the room, that equitable care wasn't political. It was professional. When everyone on this team feels seen, heard, and respected, our patients benefit. That's not theory. That's data. Still, there were difficult days. Days when Helen found herself wondering if progress was truly being made or if it was all just surface level. But then she'd receive a quiet note from a younger nurse thanking her for making them feel safe to speak up. Or she'd see a conversation happening between two staff members who never used to sit at the same lunch table. Change was happening, sometimes in small, almost imperceptible ways, but it was there. One morning, as Helen passed the main lobby, she paused in front of a newly installed mural. It depicted healthcare workers of every background: doctors, nurses, aides, all standing side by side beneath the words, "Diversity is our strength. Inclusion is our commitment." A plaque at the bottom bore Helen's name alongside Sam Brennan's. For a moment, Helen simply stood there, taking it all in. She thought about her mother, Margaret, and the strength of the women who came before her. She thought about the tears she'd held back on that first day, the whispered judgments, the smirks from colleagues who thought they knew her worth before hearing her speak. Now, she didn't need to prove herself. She was living proof of the power of persistence, the necessity of integrity, and the courage it takes to hold the door open for others after you've pushed it open yourself. And this was just the beginning. Nearly a year had passed Since Helen Whitaker had stepped into the halls of St. Mary's General Hospital as the new hire, a nurse many dismissed before she even introduced herself. But time has a way of revealing character. And now, she wasn't just a nurse. She was the hospital's Director of Diversity and Inclusion, a title earned through grit, grace, and unwavering professionalism in the face of prejudice. The hospital itself had transformed alongside her, but perhaps most telling was the subtle yet profound shift in how her former skeptics responded to her leadership. One of the most surprising developments came from Julia Harmon, a senior nurse who had once epitomized the cool indifference Helen faced daily. Julia had been at St. Mary's for over 20 years, and change didn't come easy to her. In those early days, her clipped tone and calculated glances spoke volumes. But since the hospital's cultural reckoning, ignited by Sam Brennan's bold intervention and Helen's rise, Julia had softened. She no longer avoided Helen's gaze. She no longer corrected her unnecessarily. She no longer dismissed her suggestions in meetings. In fact, on more than one occasion, she sought Helen's input directly, even deferring to her judgment with a tone of respect. It was during a lunch break in the hospital cafeteria, over lukewarm coffee and the hum of conversation, that Helen and Julia finally had a moment to speak freely. "I was wrong about you," Julia said, quietly but clearly. "I was wrong about a lot of things." Helen didn't rush to fill the silence. She let the words hang for a moment, giving them the weight they deserved. "It's okay," she finally replied, her voice steady. "What matters is what we do going forward." And going forward, they had work to do. Helen had started holding weekly roundtable discussions, voluntary but increasingly well-attended, where staff could voice their concerns, share stories, and reflect on how to build a more compassionate workplace. These weren't always easy conversations. Sometimes they were uncomfortable. Sometimes people got defensive. But Helen created a space where listening mattered more than being right, and where personal growth was encouraged rather than demanded. Sam Brennan remained a steady presence in Helen's journey. Although he had resumed his CEO responsibilities full-time at Healthcare United, he continued to visit St. Mary's when his schedule allowed. His presence always brought a sense of momentum, like a gust of wind pushing sails forward. During one visit, he pulled Helen aside. "You've started something here that's bigger than either of us," he told her. "The work you're doing, this cultural transformation, it's going to be the blueprint for every other hospital in our network." That notion weighed heavily on Helen, but it also filled her with purpose. She'd never set out to be a symbol or a leader. She just wanted to do her job with dignity and help others do the same. But the calling had grown, and Helen, true to form, met it head-on. St. Mary's began to see the fruits of this shift. Patient satisfaction scores increased. Staff turnover rates dropped. Morale improved. Most notably, a diverse group of new hires began arriving, young, passionate professionals who saw St. Mary's as a place where they could thrive. The culture that once pushed people out was now welcoming them in. Helen walked the halls daily, not because she had to, but because she believed presence mattered. She stopped to chat with janitors, physicians, cafeteria workers, new nurses, anyone who needed a moment of connection. She didn't walk with a clipboard or a badge of authority, just a listening ear and a heart open to understanding. It was Julia Harmon, of all people, who said it best during a monthly staff assembly. "Helen didn't just change policies," she told the group. "She changed how we look at each other. She reminded us that every person here brings value, and that respect isn't optional." That afternoon, as Helen looked out over the faces of the staff, she felt a quiet swell of emotion. She remembered that first day, the cold stares, the whispered doubts, the walls that seemed too high to climb. And now, those same halls echoed with laughter, collaboration, and mutual support. Yes, there was still work to do. There always would be. But Helen no longer felt like she was pushing a boulder uphill alone. Now, she was walking alongside others, some who had once doubted her, now walking beside her. And together, they were building something worth believing in. Nearly a year to the day after her first uncertain steps through the doors of St. Mary's General Hospital, Helen Whitaker stood in the spotlight of a national healthcare conference. The large carpeted auditorium buzzed with conversation, filled with professionals from across the country, hospital directors, medical educators, and frontline workers alike. The elegant lighting overhead gave the event a dignified glow, but Helen's thoughts drifted for a moment back to the fluorescent-lit halls of St. Mary's, where her journey had truly begun. She was no longer just a nurse fighting to be seen. Today, she stood as a leader, one whose courage had sparked a quiet revolution. Her voice carried gently but confidently across the room as she began, "A year ago, I was ready to walk away from healthcare. I was tired of being questioned, dismissed, overlooked, but something happened, something unexpected. I didn't just stay, I stood up." A thoughtful hush settled over the audience. Helen shared her story with the kind of clarity that comes only from lived experience. She didn't sensationalize it. She didn't need to. The power of her words came from the truth behind them. Days spent enduring subtle slights, nights replaying difficult conversations, mornings forcing herself to return to a place where she wasn't always welcomed. And yet, she persevered. The room listened, really listened, as Helen recounted the moment when Sam Brennan, a patient she'd cared for with no knowledge of his status, revealed himself as the CEO of one of the most powerful healthcare conglomerates in the country, how he had witnessed the injustice firsthand, how his support had helped turn a moment of humiliation into a movement for change. He saw what others refused to see, Helen said, pausing for effect, and more importantly, he acted. She spoke not just of her rise to become Director of Diversity and Inclusion, but of the systemic changes that followed. Mandatory cultural competency training, anonymous bias reporting systems, equitable hiring, and mentorship programs. And most importantly, a shift in how people treated one another, person to person, heart to heart. Helen emphasized, "You don't fix a broken culture with one training session. You do it by building trust." Every single day. As she continued, Helen could see nods of recognition throughout the audience, particularly from the older professionals. She spoke their language. She understood that change is hard-earned, especially in systems that have been around for decades. But she also knew that this audience, made up of seasoned caretakers and administrators, had seen enough to know when something was truly broken and worth fixing. After the speech, as applause echoed across the auditorium, Sam Brennan approached Helen backstage. His arms were now free of the casts he wore the last time they met in a hospital room, but his admiration for Helen hadn't changed one bit. "Helen," he said with a warm smile, "you've come a long way from the nurse who quietly took my vitals and asked how I was feeling. Now you're the one helping the whole industry feel something." They spoke briefly about the ripple effects already taking shape. Thanks to the transformation at St. Mary's, several other hospitals within Healthcare United's network had adopted similar diversity initiatives modeled directly after Helen's work. Helen had even begun mentoring staff members at sister hospitals, helping them navigate resistance and plant the seeds of change in their own institutions. "You've reignited something in me," Sam told her. "I've been in this business a long time, but watching you lead reminded me why I got into healthcare in the first place." On the flight back to St. Mary's, Helen looked out the window, the clouds below glowing orange in the setting sun. The journey had been anything but easy, and there were still hurdles ahead. But she wasn't walking that road alone anymore. What started as a fight for her own dignity had grown into a mission for fairness, for equity, for compassion. As she walked through the hospital lobby the next morning, the familiar mural caught her eye, a collage of diverse healthcare professionals working together under the words, "Diversity is our strength. Inclusion is our commitment. Compassion is our calling." She paused there, her heart full. This wasn't the end of the story. In many ways, it was just the beginning. 1 year after stepping into the halls of St. Mary's as just another face in the crowd, Helen Whitaker found herself standing center stage at a national healthcare conference, addressing a room full of seasoned professionals. Her voice was calm but resolute as she shared how a toxic work environment nearly pushed her out of the nursing field altogether, and how an unexpected ally turned her private struggle into a catalyst for institutional change. The room was still, many of the older attendees leaning in, nodding not just in sympathy, but in recognition. They had seen it too, those quiet injustices that simmer under the surface, ignored for far too long. Helen didn't just talk about her pain. She talked about the progress, inclusive hiring policies, new mentorship programs, and a culture shift that replaced silence with accountability. And most importantly, she spoke about rebuilding trust between colleagues, departments, and most of all, with patients. "You can't legislate kindness," she said, "but you can create space for it to grow." After her talk, Sam Brennan, the CEO whose hospital stay had changed everything, greeted her with pride in his eyes. "You've done more than reform a workplace," he told her. "You reminded all of us what this profession is supposed to stand for." Helen returned to St. Mary's with a heart full of purpose. As she walked past a new mural in the lobby celebrating diversity and compassion, she knew this was more than just a career. It was a legacy. For every patient she cared for and every healthcare worker who came after her, Helen was building something that would last far beyond her own time in scrubs. When Helen returned to St. Mary's after the conference, something had changed, not just in the hospital's policies, but in its spirit. The once cold and divided workplace now buzzed with genuine collaboration and open dialogue. Nurses who had once avoided eye contact now shared stories over coffee. Doctors consulted with a new sense of humility. And perhaps most heartening of all, Helen was greeted at the front entrance by Julia Harmon, a colleague who had once doubted her. "We're glad you came back," Julia said, offering a smile that this time felt real. As Helen walked through the lobby, her eyes were drawn to a new mural, bright, bold, and alive with color. It showed healthcare workers of all backgrounds working side by side, their eyes focused not on each other, but on the patients before them. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Diversity is our strength. Inclusion is our commitment. Compassion is our calling." Helen paused for a moment, hand resting over her heart. This wasn't just a picture on the wall. It was a promise, a symbol of how far they'd come and how much further they still had to go. But now she knew they were going forward, together. When Helen Whitaker stepped back into St. Mary's after the National Healthcare Conference, it didn't feel like the same place she had once dreaded entering. The sterile halls now carried a warmer energy, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the change she'd fought so hard to spark. Staff who had once dismissed her now greeted her with nods of respect. Even Julia Harmon, the nurse who used to avoid her, welcomed Helen with a heartfelt, "It's good to have you back." It was a quiet gesture, but to Helen, it spoke volumes. In the lobby, a newly unveiled mural caught her eye. It featured healthcare workers of all races and ages standing shoulder to shoulder in service of their patients. Beneath it, the inscription read, "Diversity is our strength. Inclusion is our commitment. Compassion is our calling." Helen stood before it, reflecting not only on how far the hospital had come, but how far she herself had grown. From struggling nurse to a respected leader, her journey had become more than personal. It was now part of something much larger. At that moment, Helen knew. She hadn't just survived St. Mary's. She had helped transform it. The transformation sparked at St. Mary's didn't end within its own walls. Helen Whitaker's courageous stand, supported by Sam Brennan's bold intervention, set off a ripple effect that spread throughout the entire Healthcare United network. Hospitals once known for their rigid traditions began re-evaluating long-standing practices. Diversity and inclusion committees were formed in facilities across the country, many led by voices that had previously gone unheard. Helen's journey became a blueprint for institutional reform, shared at national healthcare summits and embraced by administrators looking to do better. What had begun as one woman's quiet resistance in a single hospital became a movement rooted in fairness, compassion, and equity. Older doctors began mentoring with renewed awareness, while younger staff stepped forward, empowered by Helen's example. And through it all, Helen never lost sight of the people behind the policy, patients, nurses, and families who deserved better. As she stood once more before a crowd, now as a national advocate for healthcare justice, Helen humbly reminded them all, this isn't just about policy, it's about people. And no voice should ever be ignored. In the eyes of many, Helen Whitaker hadn't just changed a hospital, she helped change the future of American healthcare. One of the most profound lessons from Helen Whitaker's journey is that true change often begins with quiet courage. In the face of discrimination, injustice, and isolation, she didn't raise her voice, she raised her standards. For older Americans, many of whom have faced their own struggles through decades of shifting societal norms, this story is a powerful reminder that our legacy isn't just built by what we achieve, but by what we stand for. Helen's perseverance shows us that dignity, grace, and determination are timeless virtues. Whether we're fighting for fair treatment, speaking up for someone overlooked, or choosing to mentor rather than criticize, each act creates ripples. As we age, we carry the responsibility and the privilege of guiding the next generation with wisdom forged from experience. You don't need a title or a spotlight to make a difference. Sometimes, the most enduring impact comes from doing the right thing when no one's watching. Helen's story reminds us all, it's never too late to challenge what's broken, uplift what's good, and lead with heart. After all, the greatest legacy we can leave is a world that's just a little kinder, fairer, and more human, because we were in it.